The night Elias Whittaker opened his door, he did not know he was letting trouble in. He only knew no decent man leaves a woman standing barefoot in the rain. The storm had rolled down from the high country after sundown, dragging black clouds over the broken hills and turning the yard outside his cabin into a sheet of mud. Wind pushed dust and water through the cracks in the barn boards. His horse stamped once, uneasy. Then came the sound that made Elias lift his head from the stove. Not a knock, not a call, just the soft scrape of someone too tired to ask for help. He took the lantern from the table, crossed the room, and opened the door with his other hand resting near the old revolver on the shelf, not touching it, just remembering where it was. In the yellow light stood an Apache woman, soaked from head to heel, her dark hair clinging to her face, one hand wrapped tight around a blue-gray shawl pressed against her ribs. She could not have been more than 28, but her eyes looked older than winter. Behind her stretched the empty prairie, 3 miles of black grass and rain before the first wagon road, and 10 more before Dust Hollow, a town that would sooner lock its doors than open one for her. Elias said nothing at first. He had learned long ago that silence could be kinder than questions. The woman looked past him into the cabin, at the small fire, the tin cup on the table, the blanket hanging from a peg. She did not step closer. She did not beg. That held him. Most frightened people reached for mercy like drowning folks reached for rope. This woman stood straight in the rain, shivering, but still carrying herself like the world had taken everything except the right to choose where her feet stopped. Elias lowered the lantern a little so it would not blind her. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked. The woman's mouth moved once before sound came. No, the word was small. The storm nearly swallowed it. Elias looked toward the dark ridge beyond his pasture, where lightning showed the faint shape of hoof tracks cutting through the mud. More than one horse. Fresh. Someone had followed her close enough to make the night feel crowded. He turned back to her and opened the door wider. "Now you do." For the first time, something broke in her face, not trust, not relief, only the strain of having survived one more minute than she expected. She crossed the threshold slowly, careful not to brush against him, careful not to turn her back all the way. Elias shut the door against the wind, then placed the lantern on the table and stepped aside. "Fire's yours," he said. "Water's in the bucket. I won't ask your name unless you want it known." She watched him like a wounded hawk watches a hand. Then she moved toward the stove, each step leaving a wet print on the plank floor. The shawl slipped slightly from her grip. Elias saw the dark stain along its edge. His breath caught, quiet enough that she might not have heard it. The blood was not pouring from her. It was dried into the cloth, carried there, hidden there, protected there. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills, and far beyond the cabin, somewhere in the storm, a horse gave a sharp, distant cry. The woman tightened her hold on the shawl. Elias looked from the cloth to the door, and he understood one thing with the certainty of a man hearing a gun cock in the dark. She had not come alone. Whatever she carried had followed her all the way to his porch. Elias Whittaker had lived 5 years on that strip of land between Dust Hollow and the Red Canyon, and in all that time, no one had ever crossed his threshold after dark unless weather or desperation drove them there. The cabin was 12 feet wide, 18 feet long, built from pine, sweat, and stubbornness, with a roof that complained in every hard rain and a chimney that smoked when the wind came from the north. It was not much of a home, but it was honest. Every board had been set by his hands. Every nail had gone in straight or been pulled and driven again. Folks in town said a man who lived alone that long was either hiding from something or waiting for something worse to find him. Elias let them talk. Dust Hollow had always been rich in words and poor in mercy. He made his living breaking horses, mending fences, and guiding cattle through bad country for men who paid in coins and suspicion. He was white enough for the town when they needed work done, but not white enough when he refused to spit at the name Apache. He was useful, not welcome. That suited him most days. A man could survive a long time on coffee, beans, and being left alone. Still, there were nights when the silence inside the cabin grew so thick it seemed to sit across from him at the table. On those nights, he would take out the silver pendant his mother had worn, a small round piece marked with a rising sun, and turn it between his fingers until memory got tired of hurting. His mother had believed kindness was a debt passed forward, not paid back. She had said it near the end, when smoke from another man's lie had already darkened their family name. Elias had been 19 when his younger sister, Ruth, was lost in a barn fire outside town. The men who caused it blamed Apache raiders before the ashes cooled. The town believed them because fear was easier than truth. Later, when Elias found proof of what really happened, nobody wanted to hear it. The guilty men moved west. The town lowered its eyes. His father drank himself into the grave before the next spring. After that, Elias stopped trusting crowds. A crowd could sing hymns in the morning and cheer for cruelty by noon if the right man pointed at the right enemy. That was why, when the Apache woman stood by his stove with rain dripping from her sleeves, Elias did not see an enemy. He saw someone the world had already judged before asking one decent question. She kept her back near the wall, eyes moving from window to door to rifle rack, measuring exits the way a traveler measures water. Elias took his revolver from the shelf with 2 fingers, laid it on the far side of the table, and pushed it away from himself. Her gaze followed the motion. Something in her shoulders loosened, just a fraction. Not trust. Not yet. But enough to let the room breathe. He poured water into a tin cup and set it near the stove, then stepped back. "I have got beans warm enough to eat," he said. "Coffee if you can stand it bitter." She looked at the cup for a long moment before reaching for it. Her hands were steady, but the mud on her dress had dried in streaks, and the blue-gray shawl never left her arm. Elias noticed that most of all, not the rain, not the fear, the shawl. She held it like a mother holds a sleeping child in a room full of strangers. Outside, the storm softened. Hoofbeats did not. Somewhere beyond the dark pasture, riders were still moving. The woman drank only half the water, though her lips looked dry enough to crack. Then she set the cup down without a sound and turned her face toward the nearest window. Rain marked the glass in trembling lines. Beyond it, the pasture was nothing but black grass, moving shadows, and the faint shape of Elias's sorrel horse shifting inside the lean-to. She listened harder than any person Elias had ever seen, not with fear alone, but with knowledge. She knew the distance of a rider by the break in the mud. She knew when wind carried hoofbeats and when it only pretended to. After a long while, she spoke. "They will come before morning." Elias stood by the table, hands loose at his sides. "Who?" She looked at him then, and the fire put a copper edge along her cheek. "Men who smile when they lie." It was not much of an answer, but it was enough to make the room colder. Elias took the pot from the stove and spooned beans into a tin bowl. He set it on the chair nearest the fire and moved away before she could think he expected gratitude. "Eat what you can." She did not move toward it. Her fingers tightened around the blue-gray shawl. "I did not come to bring trouble." "Trouble was already saddled," Elias said. "You just got here first." That almost changed her face. Almost. The corner of her mouth softened, then disappeared again behind caution. She took one step toward the chair, then stopped when the floor creaked beneath her own foot. Her eyes went to the door. Elias saw it plain. She had not come here because she trusted him. She had come because the storm had narrowed the world until his cabin was the last light left. There was dignity in that, and sorrow too. He turned his back just enough to give her space, busying himself with the stove, though there was nothing there that needed tending. Behind him, he heard the small scrape of the chair, the faint sound of the bowl being lifted. She ate slowly, like a person who had learned not to believe every meal would be finished. "What should I call you?" Elias asked. The spoon stopped. For 3 breaths, only the rain answered. "Nayeli," she said at last. "Nayeli Red Willow." He nodded once, not repeating it badly, not making a show of respect. "Elias Whittaker." She looked toward the revolver lying far across the table. "You gave your weapon distance." Seemed polite. Most men do not think politeness matters when they hold power. Elias looked at the pendant hanging from a peg by his bed, its silver face catching the firelight. "My mother did." Nayeli followed his glance, but asked nothing. That earned more respect from him than a dozen kind words might have. Outside, thunder moved away, leaving a wide silence behind it. In that silence, Elias heard something under the storm's fading breath. A rhythm. Slow. Measured. Horses on wet ground. Not close enough to see, but close enough to be real. Nayeli heard it too. She put the bowl down and rose before the sound had fully entered the cabin. The shawl came tight against her chest again. Elias crossed to the window and lifted the edge of the curtain with one finger. For a moment, there was only darkness. Then lightning opened the ridge. 3 riders stood there, still as fence posts, watching the cabin from a quarter-mile away. Nayeli whispered, "Do not hand me back." Elias let the curtain fall. "I am not planning to." Her eyes searched his face, looking for the lie every hunted soul expects. "You do not know what I carry." Elias looked at the shawl. No, the hoofbeats started again, moving down from the ridge. Nayeli's voice dropped lower than the fire. "Then you do not know what it will cost you." Elias reached for the lantern, turned the flame down until the room sank into amber shadow, and said, "I know what it costs a man to close a door when somebody needs it open." The riders did not hurry. That was what made them feel worse. Men with honest need usually came fast through rain, shouting before they reached the porch, glad for a roof and a dry match. These men came slow, letting their horses pick through the mud as if the whole night belonged to them. Elias stood near the door with the lantern turned low, listening to each wet hoof step draw closer. Nayeli had moved into the shadow beside the stove, not hiding exactly, but becoming still in that Apache way that made the ice slide past her if a person was not careful. The blue-gray shawl stayed pressed beneath her arm. The stain along its edge looked black in the dim firelight. When the first horse stopped outside, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. A gloved fist knocked 3 times, polite as church bells. Elias opened the door only halfway. Sheriff Able Crowley sat tall in the saddle, rain shining on the brim of his hat and on the tin star pinned to his coat. 2 men waited behind him, broad shapes under slickers, faces shadowed, hands resting easy where men liked to remind the world they carried authority. Crowley smiled like he had practiced it in a mirror. "Evening, Whittaker. Rough weather for company." Elias kept one hand on the door and the other hanging empty at his side. "Then you picked a poor night to visit." Crowley's eyes moved past him, slow and hungry, searching the room without asking permission. Apache woman came through here. Young, dark dress, carrying something she stole from lawful custody. Elias did not look back. "Have you got a warrant?" The smile thinned. "This is frontier business. That is not a warrant." One of the riders shifted in his saddle. Leather creaked. A horse blew steam into the rain. Crowley leaned forward just a little, enough for the lantern light to catch the pale scar near his jaw. "You always did enjoy making simple things difficult. She is dangerous." From the stove, Nayeli made no sound. Elias could feel her listening, not just to words, but to the spaces where lies stood barefoot. "Dangerous how?" he asked. Crowley sighed, patient for the benefit of men who were not there. "Theft, spying, stirring up trouble with her people. There are families in Dust Hollow scared to sleep tonight, and you would not want their fear on your hands." Elias thought of Ruth then, of smoke, of men pointing toward the hills because Apache was an easier word than guilt. "Fear travels cheap," he said. "Truth costs more." Crowley's eyes cooled. "Careful, son. I am 42, still old enough to know better." Rain ran from the sheriff's hat in steady drops. He looked again into the cabin, and this time his gaze found the second cup on the table, the bowl near the chair, the wet footprints dark across the floorboards. The smile came back, smaller and uglier. "Looks to me like you have been hospitable." Elias opened the door a little wider, not enough to invite, just enough to show he was not ashamed. "My door is mine." Crowley's voice softened. That was when Elias trusted at least. "She is not your kind." The words sat between them, mean and small. Elias glanced once toward the fire, where Nayeli stood in shadow with her chin lifted and her eyes fixed on the floor, as if she had heard those words so many times they had lost the right to wound her. He looked back at Crowley. "My door says different." For several seconds, even the rain seemed to quiet. Then Crowley gathered his reins. "Morning, then. I will come back with witnesses. Maybe half the town. Folks like seeing what side a man chooses." He turned his horse toward the ridge, then paused. "And Whittaker, when a man shelters a lie, he starts belonging to it." Elias watched the 3 riders disappear into the dark wash of rain. Only when the hoofbeats faded did he close the door. Nayeli finally breathed. "He will bring them all." Elias slid the bolt into place. "Then we had better know what he is afraid of." The bolt had barely settled into place when Nayeli stepped away from the stove and laid the blue-gray shawl on Elias's table. She did it carefully, with both hands, the way some folks laid a Bible down before speaking hard truth. The fire snapped once in the silence. Elias did not reach for it. He had seen enough frightened people to know that some burdens had to be opened by the hands that carried them. Nayeli touched the edge of the shawl, then looked toward the window where rain still shivered against the glass. 6 children, she said. Elias felt the words land heavy in the room. Apache? She nodded. From Red Willow Camp. The youngest is 5. The oldest is 11. They were taken near the Wash Road 3 nights ago. Her fingers found a loose seam along the shawl, pulled it open, and drew out a narrow strip of oiled paper folded so small it could have hidden beneath a button. She placed it beside the cup. It was a map, rough but clear, marked with creek beds, ridges, and a small circle near Dry Creek Canyon, nearly 8 miles east of the cabin. They are there. Elias asked, if they have not been moved. The answer was steady, but her eyes were not. She unfolded another piece from the lining, this one covered in names, numbers, and short notes written in a tidy white man's hand. Elias leaned close enough to read, and the room seemed to lose warmth. There were first names only, little names. Daniel, Cully, Mesa, Latana, Sam, Elu. Beside each was a number, a date, and a place farther west along the freight road. No wounds needed showing for a man to understand evil. Sometimes ink was enough. Crowley wrote this. Elias asked. Nayeli lifted her chin. He kept it in his office. My younger sister, Sonny, worked there washing floors after they promised food for our old ones. She saw the book. She heard them speak of the children like sacks of flour. Elias looked again at the list, and something old moved behind his ribs, something he had buried with Ruth and his father, and every unanswered truth Dust Hollow had refused to hear. Where is your sister now? Nayeli's hand closed over the torn seam. With Crowley. The firelight trembled across her face, but she did not let grief bend her. She gave me the shawl through the back window and told me to run. She said if one of us reached the canyon, the children could still be found before morning. Elias straightened slowly. 8 miles to Dry Creek in wet ground. Less if they cut past Split Rock and risked the washout. More if Crowley had men on the road. His horse was strong, but not silent. Nayeli watched him measure the night. You can still tell me to leave, she said. No, you do not owe my people anything. Elias looked at the silver pendant near his bed, then at the map on his table, then at the list of 6 names that should never have been written by a sheriff's hand. Maybe I owe the truth. Outside, the rain began to thin, and with it came the faint smell of wet sage and cold dirt. Dawn was still hours away, but the dark had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt watched. Elias took his coat from the peg and set it beside the shawl. Dry Creek is 8 miles if we are lucky. Nayeli's eyes narrowed. Those children do not need one rider. He lifted the pendant from the peg and slipped it into his pocket. They need 2 who know what they are riding for. Nayeli folded the map back into the shawl, but the list she left on the table between them. 6 names in black ink. 6 small lives waiting in the cold. Then, from beyond the barn, Elias heard a single board creak where no wind could reach it. The creak came again, soft as a guilty thought. Elias raised one hand, and Nayeli went still beside the table. No fear crossed her face now, only attention, the kind that made every shadow accountable. Elias took the lantern but kept the flame low, then moved to the back window and looked toward the barn. Rainwater dripped from the roof in silver strings. His sorrel stood with ears forward, staring into the dark corner near the feed barrels. Someone was there. Elias opened the back door slowly, not enough to make a show of courage, just enough to let his voice pass through. Step out where I can see you. For a long second, nothing moved. Then a young man in a deputy coat emerged from the side of the barn with both hands raised, hat dripping, face pale under the rain. Martin Pike looked no older than 25, though worry had already started carving lines around his mouth. I am not here for Crowley, he said. Then you picked a strange place to hide, Elias answered. Pike swallowed and looked past him into the cabin. When he saw Nayeli, shame moved across his face before fear could cover it. I know about the children. Nayeli stepped into the doorway, the shawl held close. Where are they? Pike shook his head quickly. Dry Creek, last I heard. But Crowley sent 2 men ahead before he came here. If they get nervous, they will move them to the freight shed by first light. Elias studied him. Deputy Pike had been a quiet fixture in Dust Hollow, always standing half a step behind the sheriff, always looking like a man who heard more than he said. That kind of man could be cowardly. Or waiting. Sometimes both. Why tell us? Elias asked. Pike looked toward the ridge, where the sheriff had vanished into the storm. Because I watched him pin crimes on people who could not defend themselves. Because I told myself keeping my badge meant I could help later. Then later kept moving farther away. His voice thinned. And because one of those children is only 5 years old. No one spoke after that. The truth had a way of making decent excuses sound cheap. Elias stepped back inside, took his coat, and handed Pike the list from the table. Can you get us to Dry Creek without touching the wagon road? Pike nodded. There is an old cattle trail past Split Rock. Muddy, narrow, but it cuts 2 miles. Nayeli's eyes stayed on him. If you lie, the children pay for it. Pike met her gaze with difficulty. I know. Within minutes, the cabin emptied of warmth. Elias saddled the sorrel and an old bay mare by lantern shadow, while Nayeli tightened the shawl beneath her coat. Pike rode a rangy gray horse that looked as tired as he did. They left without dousing the fire, letting the cabin glow behind them like someone was still inside, like comfort could be used as a decoy. The trail east ran low through wet grass and patches of mesquite, then climbed toward the dark shoulder of Split Rock. Dawn had not broken, but the sky had begun to pale at the edges, a thin iron color over the hills. No one wasted words. Pike rode ahead, guiding them past gullies filled with rainwater. Nayeli rode beside Elias, balanced and silent, the shawl held against her like a promise. Once, near a wash crossing, the bay mare slipped, and Elias reached instinctively for Nayeli's rein. She steadied the horse before he touched it. Their eyes met for half a breath. No apology, no pride, just understanding. She could carry herself. He could ride beside her anyway. At the top of the rise, Dry Creek Canyon opened below, a pale scar running through red earth and scrub. Pike raised his hand. All 3 horses stopped. There should have been smoke from a small hidden fire. There should have been tracks clustered near the cottonwoods. There should have been children waiting in the cold. Instead, the canyon lay empty. Nayeli dismounted before Elias could speak and moved down the slope with the speed of dread, held under control. Near the creek bed, half buried in wet sand, she found a small cloth doll with black yarn hair. She picked it up with both hands. For the first time that night, her face changed completely. Pike looked toward the west, where Dust Hollow waited under the coming dawn. We are too late, he whispered. Nayeli closed her fingers around the doll. Elias looked at the wagon tracks pressed deep in the mud, all leading back toward town. No, he said quietly. We are not too late. We just know where the lie is going next. The ride back to Dust Hollow felt shorter than the ride out, though the horses were more tired and the sky had turned the color of old tin. Elias kept his eyes on the wagon tracks, 2 deep lines dragging through the mud toward town, steady as a confession. Nayeli rode with the cloth doll tucked inside her coat, close to the blue-gray shawl, and every time the wind shifted, Elias saw her fingers press against it, as if she could keep the child it belonged to warm by will alone. Deputy Pike said little. His gray horse stumbled once near the wash road, and he whispered an apology to the animal like a man practicing for larger sins. By the time the first roofs of Dust Hollow appeared beyond the cottonwoods, the town was already awake. Bells were ringing. Not church bells. Alarm bells. The kind meant to gather fear into one place. Men stood outside the mercantile with suspenders half-fastened and rifles held low. Women watched from porches with shawls pulled tight. Children peered through railings until their mothers drew them back. In the center of town, near the courthouse steps, Sheriff Crowley had built his mourning like a stage. A wagon stood beside the hitching rail. A few freight crates were stacked nearby, and in front of them, guarded by 2 nervous men, sat 6 Apache children wrapped in flour sacks and old blankets, their faces silent, their eyes too wide for dawn. Nayeli's breath caught, but she did not cry out. Elias respected her more for that than he could have said. Crowley stood on the courthouse porch, clean coat buttoned, badge bright, smile ready for witnesses. There they are, he called, loud enough for every window to hear. The traitor Cowboy and the Apache woman who led trouble to our door. The crowd shifted like grass under wind. Elias felt the old sickness of it, that warm hunger people got when someone handed them an enemy simple enough to understand. A man near the blacksmith shop muttered. Another spat in the dirt. Widow Clarabelle, who sold bread from the side window of her house, stared at Nayeli with fear fighting shame across her face. Elias dismounted slowly, keeping both hands visible. Nayeli did the same. Pike stayed mounted a moment longer, caught between badge and conscience, then swung down like the ground had finally demanded an answer from him. Crowley's eyes found the deputy, and the smile flickered. "Martin, you are standing in poor company." Pike took off his hat. "I have stood in worse." A quiet murmur moved through the town. Crowley raised one hand, claiming the air back. These children were found hidden outside town with stolen goods. This woman carried papers meant to stir up an Apache attack. And Whittaker here gave her shelter while decent families slept in danger. Elias looked at the 6 children. The youngest boy clutched a strip of blanket with both hands. The girl beside him had black yarn on her sleeve where a doll had once been held. Nayeli saw it too. Her face went still as stone in winter. "Where is Sonny?" she asked. Crowley tilted his head. "Who?" "My sister." The sheriff spread his hands. "I cannot answer for every stray soul wandering the territory." It was a small sentence. Too small. But it landed wrong. Even some in the crowd heard it. Elias stepped forward one pace. "Children are not evidence, Sheriff." Crowley's smile returned, colder now. "No, but fear is. And this town has plenty." He turned to the crowd, letting the words bloom. "Ask yourselves why a white man would hide an Apache woman unless he had forgotten his own people." The town went quiet. That was when Elias understood Crowley did not need chains or even proof. He only needed the crowd to look away from the children and toward skin, toward old stories, toward anything easier than 6 small faces in the cold. Nayeli reached inside her coat and touched the shawl. The ledger was still gone, taken with Sonny, but the map remained, and maybe enough truth stitched into cloth could still breathe. Then, from behind the freight office, came a faint sound. A child's cough. Pike turned first. Elias saw Crowley's jaw tighten. Nayeli heard it too, and her eyes sharpened. The 6 children in front of the crowd were not all of them. The cough came again, small and hidden behind the freight office wall. For a breath, nobody moved. Then Nayeli turned her head toward the sound, and Elias saw recognition strike her before words could. Not fear this time. Hope, sharp enough to hurt. Crowley stepped down from the porch too quickly. "Keep your eyes forward," he snapped. But the order only made half the town look the other way. Deputy Pike moved first, not fast, not dramatic, just steady. He walked past the stacked crates and toward the narrow space between the freight office and the livery wall. One of Crowley's men shifted to block him. Pike took the deputy badge from his coat and held it out in his palm. "I am still sworn to the law," he said. "Not to you." The man hesitated. That hesitation opened the morning. Pike stepped around him and pulled back a canvas tarp hanging from the freight wall. Beneath it, sitting on dry straw, were 2 more children and a young Apache woman with tired eyes and her hands wrapped around a small leather book. Nayeli whispered one word. "Sonny." The young woman looked up, and all the strength Nayeli had been holding inside her face nearly broke loose, but she kept it quiet. She only crossed the dirt street and knelt in front of her sister, touching her forehead to Sonny's for one silent second. No one in Dust Hollow spoke, not even Crowley. Sonny rose with care and placed the leather book into Nayeli's hands. The cover was damp, the corners bent, but the pages inside were safe. Nayeli carried it back to the courthouse steps and laid the blue-gray shawl beside it. The shawl looked plain there, faded and stained by rain, no grander than any cloth a woman might use against cold. Then she opened the hidden seam and unfolded the map. Pike opened the book. Elias did not need to say much. He read aloud only what mattered. Names, dates, places, payments promised. The same 6 names from the list. Then 2 more. Then Sonny's name written in a margin, marked as a problem to be removed from town before sunrise. A low sound moved through the crowd. Not anger yet, not apology, something quieter and more useful. Understanding. Widow Clarabelle stepped off her porch with one hand pressed against her mouth. Her eyes went from the children to the sheriff, and the fear in them changed shape. "Able," she said softly, "tell us that is not your writing." Crowley looked at the book, then at the crowd, then at Elias. His face tried to find the smile that had carried him through so many lies, but this time it would not come. The town had seen ink. The children had seen daylight. The woman he called dangerous had brought evidence, not fire. Elias stepped aside so the crowd could see Nayeli clearly. She stood with the shawl in one hand and her sister beside her, neither asking for pity, neither lowering her eyes. Crowley reached for words and found only dust. Deputy Pike walked to him and held out his hand. "The badge," he said. Crowley stared at him. Pike did not raise his voice. "You have worn it long enough." For a moment, the whole town balanced on that sentence. Then Crowley unpinned the star and dropped it into Pike's palm. It made a small sound, hardly louder than a coin on wood, but every person in Dust Hollow heard it. Beyond the East Road, a line of Apache riders appeared on the ridge, 70 strong, sitting their horses in perfect silence beneath the pale morning sun. They carried no threat into town. They simply watched as truth did what no gun ever could. The Apache riders remained on the ridge without entering Dust Hollow. Their horses lined shoulder to shoulder against the pale sun, and that silence unsettled the town more than shouting ever could have. Chief Taza Red Willow rode at the center on a paint horse, his gray braids resting over a weathered buckskin coat, his eyes fixed not on the sheriff, not on the crowd, but on the children wrapped in old blankets beside the courthouse steps. Nayeli walked to him first, carrying the blue-gray shawl folded across both arms. Sonny followed with the smallest child holding her hand. No one stopped them. No one dared make the morning smaller than it had become. When Chief Taza dismounted, the children ran to him, and he lowered himself to one knee as if the whole earth had waited for that moment. He touched each head gently, counting without speaking, making sure every name had found its breath again. Then he looked toward Elias. For a long time, the two men only stood there, one Apache, one white, with a town full of shame between them. Elias did not tip his hat like a performer. He did not explain himself. He only nodded once, because some truths were too plain to dress up. Chief Taza returned the nod, deeper than expected, and Dust Hollow saw something it had no words for. Respect crossing a road where fear had lived for years. Deputy Pike led Crowley away from the courthouse porch, not with triumph, but with the tired steadiness of a man finally carrying the right burden. Crowley's badge stayed in Pike's coat pocket, dull now, stripped of its false shine. Widow Clarabelle came down from her porch with a basket of bread in both hands. She stopped before Nayeli, unable to meet her eyes at first. Then she lifted the basket toward the children. "It is fresh," she said, her voice almost breaking. Nayeli looked at the bread, then at the woman offering it. She took one loaf and handed it to the smallest boy. That was all. No forgiveness spoken. No sermon needed. The boy ate, and Clarabelle wept quietly into her apron. By noon, the Apache riders began moving east, slow and orderly, the children safe among them. Sonny rode beside her father. Nayeli stood near the edge of town, the shawl over her shoulders now, no longer hiding anything. Elias waited by his sorrel, one hand resting on the saddle horn. "Your people are leaving," he said. "Yes. You will be safe with them." She looked toward the ridge, then back toward the long road past his cabin, where rain had washed the night clean from the grass. Safe is not always the same as home. Elias said nothing. He had learned enough to let important words find their own feet. Nayeli stepped closer and held out the silver pendant from his coat pocket. He had not noticed she had carried it since Dry Creek. "You dropped this near the canyon," she said. Elias took it, his fingers brushing only the edge of the metal. "My mother's. She taught you to open doors." He looked down at the rising sun carved into silver, then toward the cabin miles beyond town, small against the wide land. "She tried." Nayeli's eyes softened, but her voice stayed steady. "Then she did well." The Apache riders waited on the ridge, patient as stone. Dust Hollow watched from its porches, quieter than it had ever been. Elias mounted his horse, then turned him toward the road home. After a few steps, he heard another horse fall in beside him. Nayeli rode the bay mare, the blue-gray shawl moving gently in the clean wind. He did not ask why she came. She did not explain. The answer was there in the road, in the silence, in the way two riders left town together without needing the town to understand. And after that morning, folks in Dust Hollow remembered that justice had not arrived with thunder. It came wrapped in rain, carried in cloth, guarded by children,